Before Darth Sidious, before Darth Bane, before Darth Revan, before any of them, there was a people, a real people, with a home world, with children, with ancestors buried in mountains so old, the mountains had forgotten being young. And every single Dark Lord who ever lived, every Sith who ever ignited a red blade or carved an empire from the bones of the galaxy, every one of them owes their title, their tradition, and their very name to this people. A people almost no one talks about. A people the galaxy forgot. This is their story. And it is stranger, older, and darker than anything you have been told. Here is what most people do not know. The word Sith did not begin as the name of a religion. It was not invented by fallen Jedi. It was not created in some ancient schism or born from philosophy or war. It was the name of a species, living, breathing beings who had existed on a world at the edge of the galaxy for tens of thousands of years before any Jedi ever fell from grace, before any human ever held a lightsaber, before the Republic even knew this corner of space existed. A civilization completely invisible to the galaxy, developing something in the dark that the galaxy would later call the most dangerous tradition in its history. Who were they? Really? What did they build? What did they lose? And how does a people give their name to an entire religion that eventually forgets them completely? That is what we are here to find out. And it begins on a world that the dark side of the Force never left. Korriban is not a gentle world. It never has been. The planet sits in the Horusset system, far from the safe and well-lit corridors of the core worlds, far from the bustling trade routes and Senate chambers and Jedi academies that would come to define galactic civilization in later ages. Korriban is a world of red valleys and bone-colored cliffs and skies that carry the color of old blood at any hour of the day. The sun that lights it does so without warmth, casting everything in a pale and ancient radiance that seems to drain rather than illuminate. The mountains are enormous and silent. The valleys between them are deep enough to lose entire armies in. And the winds that move through those valleys carry with them a sound that beings who have visited the world often describe the same way. A sound like something vast and barely contained breathing through the stone. The dark side of the Force is strong on Korriban, stronger there than almost anywhere else in the known galaxy. And this was not a coincidence. The dark side did not simply accumulate on Korriban by accident over time. It was always there, from the very earliest age of the planet's geological history. The concentrations of dark side energy in the rock and soil and air of that world were unlike anything found elsewhere. Scholars in later centuries would debate the cause. Some believed that some ancient catastrophe, some long-forgotten wound in the Force, had scarred the planet in ways that permanently altered its spiritual nature. Others suggested that the Celestials themselves, those near-divine architects of the early galaxy, had touched the world in some way during their long administration of galactic order. Still, others argued simply that certain places in the galaxy are like this, that the Force, which flows through all living things and binds the galaxy together, pools and gathers in particular locations with particular intensity, the way water collects in the lowest point of any terrain. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. Korriban was a world saturated with the dark side of the Force from its very beginning. And it was on this world, under these red skies, in these valleys of ancient stone, that a people grew. They did not call themselves Sith at first. The name they used for themselves in the earliest period of their history is lost, buried under so many layers of conquest and cultural transformation that no linguist or archivist has ever convincingly recovered it. What we know them as, what history calls them, is the Sith species. And they were remarkable. They were humanoid in form. Broadly, the way that so many species across the galaxy share a basic body plan, a trunk and limbs, and a head arranged in the same approximate configuration. But the details of the Sith species were entirely their own. Their skin was red, not the faint redness of a flush or a burn, but a deep, rich, saturated crimson that varied from individual to individual across a spectrum from dark burgundy to something close to the color of fresh embers. Their faces were angular, structured, with strong brow ridges that gave many of them an expression of permanent intensity, even in repose. Their eyes were striking. In the earliest historical accounts that survive from the period after outside contact was established, observers consistently described the eyes of the Sith species as vivid, as luminous, as carrying a quality of attention that made other beings instinctively uneasy, without being able to explain why. The color varied, but gold and amber and deep yellow were common, and those who were particularly strong in the Force often had eyes that seemed to catch light in a way that ordinary eyes simply did not. Their bodies were adorned naturally with features that had no equivalent in most humanoid species. Many Sith individuals had bone spurs growing from their cheeks and chins, protrusions of varying size and complexity that were entirely natural, developed through genetics rather than any external modification. Others had prominent facial tendrils, thin, flexible appendages that hung from the lower face or chin, sensitive enough to detect subtle vibrations in the air around them. Their hands often had a different structure from human hands, sometimes with longer fingers, sometimes with subtle differences in proportion that made them look, to outside eyes, deeply and unsettlingly alien. Taken together, the appearance of a Sith individual was one that communicated something before a single word was spoken. Power, history, belonging to something ancient. And in a sense, that impression was exactly correct. The Sith species had lived on Korriban for an almost incomprehensible span of time. Their recorded history, in the sense of the records that survived, the many catastrophes that came later, reaches back approximately 100,000 years before the Battle of Yavin. But their actual presence on the world is almost certainly older than that. Older, perhaps, than any precise dating can establish with confidence. They grew there, they evolved there, and the dark side of the Force, so thick in the soil beneath their feet and the air they breathed, and the stone of the valleys they sheltered in, shaped them in ways both physical and spiritual over those uncounted generations. The Force sensitivity of the Sith species was not incidental. It was not a random mutation that appeared in a small percentage of their population the way it did in most other species across the galaxy. It was, rather, a characteristic of the species as a whole. Every Sith individual had some degree of Force sensitivity. In most individuals, this sensitivity was modest, manifesting as heightened intuition, as an almost preternatural awareness of the emotional states of beings around them, as occasional flashes of prescience or empathic connection so intense it could be disorienting. In a smaller number of individuals, perhaps one in every several dozen, the sensitivity ran much deeper. These were the ones who became the sorcerers and the shamans and the priest kings of Sith civilization. These were the ones who could do things that their less gifted kin could not explain and did not try to. The Force, as the Sith species understood it in this early period, was not an abstract philosophical concept or a mystical energy field to be studied and analyzed. It was simply the world. It was the way reality worked. The dark side was not a temptation to them or a corruption. It was the nature of the Force as they experienced it, shaped by the world that had shaped them, something felt in the gut and the blood and the bone, rather than understood through meditation. Their magic, as later observers would call it, was real. The sorcerers among the early Sith could do things that defied ordinary explanation. They could look into the future and read fragments of what was coming. They could speak to the dead, or at least to whatever echoes of the dead persisted in the dark side energies of Korriban's valleys and tombs. They could shape and alter living tissue, could call down lightning from the crimson skies, could move objects with their minds and crush the will of lesser beings with a focused effort of concentration that the untrained might have mistaken for nothing more than a long stare. And this power was woven into every aspect of their civilization, not held apart from it, not reserved for a separate class of scholar warriors, but present in their agriculture and their warfare and their architecture and their governance and their art and their death rites and their understanding of what it meant to be alive. The Sith were not, in this early period, a unified people. They were never particularly inclined toward unity as a natural state. The very nature of their spiritual tradition, which honored strength and passion and the intensity of individual will, made cooperation a thing that required effort rather than coming easily. They organized themselves into clans, each clan claiming territory in particular valleys or mountain ranges or plateaus of Korriban's uneven landscape. Clan identity was paramount. A Sith individual knew their clan lineage back many generations and understood their place within that lineage with a precision that outsiders might find startling. The strongest Force users in each clan held authority. This was not a tradition that was ever formally instituted or codified. It was simply the natural order of things in a species where the Force was felt as directly and undeniably as physical strength. You could not pretend to have it if you did not. You could not fake the capacity to still the will of a rival in a moment of confrontation, or to reach into the dark side and shape it to your purpose. The strong led because it was obvious to everyone, including the strong themselves, that this was the correct arrangement. The title they used for their leaders, the word that much later would be translated into basic as Sith Lord, was in this period purely a spiritual designation. It meant something closer to Great One, or one who has been claimed by the dark. It had no military meaning yet. It had no connotation of galaxy-spanning ambition. It referred simply to an individual whose connection to the Force was so deep and so commanding that the clan around them felt the pull of it, the way smaller objects feel the pull of something massive. Their physical world was reflected in their spiritual world. Korriban's dead valleys and bone-white cliffs and ancient stone were sacred. The tombs of their ancestors, carved deep into the living rock of the mountains, were not merely burial places but temples. The dead of the Sith, the truly powerful dead, did not entirely leave. This was understood not as superstition but as observable fact. The dark side of the Force preserved something of those individuals. It kept their presence alive in a form that the sorcerers of the living generation could reach. Consulting the dead was a normal part of governance. Before any major decision, before any war, before any ceremony of succession, a Sith Lord of sufficient power would descend into the ancestral tombs and speak to what waited there in the dark. What they received in return was not always clear or comfortable. The dead of the Sith were not gentle. They were, as they had been in life, demanding and fierce, and possessed of opinions they communicated without patience. But the guidance they offered was real, and the civilization that built itself around this practice of ancestor communion was, in its own way, deeply sophisticated. Not in the sense that later galactic cultures would have recognized sophistication. There were no great universities, no sprawling cities of glass and light, no interstellar trade or diplomatic delegation. Korriban was isolated in this period, entirely unknown to the Republic, entirely outside any map that mattered. But within the terms of what the Sith species had built on their world, within the framework of their values and their understanding of power and purpose, their civilization had real depth, real history, real tragedy, and real greatness. For most of those long thousands of years before outside contact, the story of the Sith species was largely a story of war against themselves. The clans competed for territory. Alliances formed and dissolved across generations. Strong lords rose and forged confederacies that stretched across wide regions of Korriban's landscape, only for those confederacies to fracture in the generation after their founders died, breaking back into smaller and more bitter factions carrying new wounds along with the old ones. It was not chaos, exactly. There was always structure. There were customs around warfare that were observed, at least most of the time. There were sacred periods when fighting was suspended. There were protocols for the treatment of defeated enemies that, when followed, prevented conflicts from becoming purely about extermination. The Sith had too much respect for strength to want to simply erase the strong, even when the strong were enemies. A defeated lord of genuine power was more valuable alive than dead, more useful as a vassal or a rival kept close than as a corpse in a valley. These were not soft people, but they were not simply violent animals either. They were something more complicated and more interesting than that. They were a people who had taken the hardest possible environment, physical and spiritual, and built something lasting within it, something that endured. The valleys of Korriban were full of their work, temples hewn directly from mountainsides, their facades carved with images of their greatest lords in postures of absolute authority, surrounded by intricate patterns that represented the movements of the Force as the Sith understood them. Tombs that went so deep into the rock that explorers who entered them in later centuries sometimes spoke of feeling the weight of the mountain pressing on their consciousness long before they reached the actual burial chambers. Monuments to battles won and enemies consumed, and moments when the dark side had moved through a particular individual so powerfully that the event deserved permanent commemoration. This was not a civilization that planned to end. It was a civilization that planned to last forever. And, in a sense, it was right, though not in the way it expected. The story of King Adas begins in a period of unusual unity for the Sith species, and that unity is not coincidental. It is the product of him. Adas was, by any measure, extraordinary. He was born into one of the major Sith clans in a period when the usual cycle of confederation and fragmentation was in one of its more destructive phases, when several powerful lords were each strong enough to dominate their immediate region, but not strong enough to decisively defeat all the others, which meant the wars between them were grinding and prolonged and costly in ways that the Sith, even with their tolerance for conflict, found exhausting. Adas was different from his first years of serious training. His connection to the Force was not merely strong. it was of a different quality from anything the elder sorcerers of his clan had encountered before. When Adus reached into the dark side, it responded with a fullness and a velocity that observers described, even at the time, as something beyond ordinary talent. His mastery of the sorceries that formed the foundation of Sith spiritual practice came quickly and went deeper than the techniques themselves, reached toward applications that the traditional approaches had not imagined. He was also, importantly, a warrior. In a civilization where physical capability and force-guided combat were inseparable, Adus excelled in both dimensions equally, which was rarer than it sounds. Many great sorcerers were not great fighters. Many great fighters had only modest command of the Force in its more subtle applications. Adus was complete in a way that his people had only rarely seen. His skin was darker than most, almost black in certain lights, and his bearing was such that even as a young man, the elder lords of his clan unconsciously deferred to him in ways that they would not have been able to explain if pressed. He rose to leadership of his clan without significant opposition, not through treachery or political maneuvering, but simply because, by the time the moment came, no one in the clan honestly believed they were better suited to lead than he was. What followed was one of the few periods in early Sith history that might genuinely be called a golden age. Adus did not conquer the other clans of Korriban through simple military force, though military force was certainly part of how his consolidation worked. He conquered them through the unmistakable weight of his presence in the Force, through the absolute conviction he carried that Korriban was one world and the Sith were one people, and the endless internal war was a waste of strength that could be directed at something worthier. This argument was not new. Other lords had made versions of it before. What was new was the person making it, and the sense that something fundamental had shifted in the spiritual life of the planet, that the dark side itself was organizing around this individual in a way that had not happened before and was not going to be argued with. He unified the clans. He ended the cycle of internal warfare that had defined Sith existence for generations. He established a singular authority over Korriban that was recognized by virtually all the surviving clans and their lords, not because they had no choice, though some had no choice, but because Adus was genuinely the strongest. And in a culture that measured everything by strength, that settled the question. Under Adus, Korriban changed. The great valley fortresses of the individual clans were connected by roads, actual roads, engineered works that cut through the bone-colored rock with a precision that spoke of organized labor at a scale the fragmented clan system had never managed. Temples were expanded and formalized. The ancestor communion rituals that had always been practiced clan by clan were brought under a unified structure, with Adus himself serving as the supreme intermediary between the living Sith and the accumulated dead of all the clans together. He was not merely a political leader, he was a spiritual one. The Dark Lord in the original and deepest sense of that title. The one who stood at the center of the Sith people's relationship with the Force. The records that survive from this period, preserved in fragmentary form through the long nightmare of everything that came after, describe Adus with the language of myth. He is called the Sith Ari in some texts, a word that carries the meaning of perfect being, the ideal of what the Sith species was meant to produce. He ruled for centuries. This was not normal. The average Sith Lord of the pre-Adus period had a reign measured in decades at most, ended by war or assassination or the simple failure of age. Adus ruled for over 300 years. Whether this longevity was a product of his extraordinary Force connection or of the dark side techniques he developed during his long reign, or of something else entirely, is not known with certainty. What is known is that he ruled, and that the Sith species under his rule became something it had not been before. Unified, coherent, recognizable as a civilization in the sense that later galactic observers would have understood the word. And then the sky opened, and strangers arrived. And everything Adas had built was tested in a way he had not anticipated. The Rakata were not strangers to brutality. The infinite empire they commanded at the height of their power was one of the most expansive and most ruthless civilizations the galaxy had ever produced. They were a species who had discovered early in their history that the Force could be used to power technology in ways that conventional physics did not allow, and they had built an entire civilization around that discovery. Their hyperdrives worked through the Force. Their weapons worked through the Force. Their most powerful construction, the Star Forge, was a vast automated shipyard that drew on the dark side to produce war material at a pace no conventional factory could match. They traveled to worlds where the Force ran strong, which is to say they traveled to worlds that were home to Force-sensitive species. And they consumed those worlds. They enslaved the populations. They stripped the resources. They used the Force sensitivity of the enslaved beings to power their technology and their empire's expansion. They had done this across hundreds of worlds by the time they found Korriban. The Rakata who arrived above Korriban were not an exploratory delegation. They were not scientists or diplomats or curious travelers. They came in ships that were weapons in themselves, sleek and dark and alive in the Force, in a way that every Sith on the planet's surface would have felt simultaneously: a sudden pressure in the air, a shift in the dark side, as something massive and foreign entered the world's spiritual field. The Sith had no spaceships. They had never needed them. Their world was their world. And the stars above were not something they had considered reaching for. The appearance of the Rakatan fleet above Korriban was therefore not simply a military or political shock, but a cosmological one. The sky, which had always been the sky, the limit above which the world ended and nothing began, had turned out to contain things, large, powerful, Force-active things that arrived without warning and intended to take what they found. The initial Rakatan approach was what it usually was with new conquests, a demonstration of power calculated to produce immediate surrender. The Rakata had done this enough times to have refined their technique. They showed what their technology could do. They communicated through whatever means they had developed for first contact, the terms of what was being offered, which was not really an offer at all, but a demand dressed in the language of opportunity. Submit, serve, provide what we require. In exchange, you will not be entirely destroyed. This approach had worked on many worlds. It did not work on Korriban. The Sith species, shaped by their world and their history and their spiritual tradition, did not have the same relationship to displays of power that many other species did. Displays of power, to the Sith, were not inherently intimidating. They were provocations. They were invitations to determine whether the power on display was as great as it seemed, or whether it could be defeated, or whether the being making the display could be broken. King Adas looked at the Rakatan fleet in the sky above his unified world and saw not gods and not inevitable conquerors, but enemies with impressive tools. He began to plan. The war between the Sith under Adas and the Rakata of the Infinite Empire was brutal in ways that even the long history of Sith internal conflict had not quite prepared the species for. The Rakata had technology. They had weapons that could strike from orbit. They had ground forces equipped with machinery that a pre-spaceflight civilization had no natural counter to. But they had not fought a world where every individual had some degree of force sensitivity, where the dark side itself ran so powerfully through the landscape that it could be wielded by someone who knew how to reach it, and where the unified leadership of a genuinely extraordinary Dark Lord could coordinate resistance at a level that their previous conquests had never required them to deal with. Adas used everything. He used the terrain, the valleys and mountains of Korriban that his people knew in intimate detail, and the Rakata did not. He used the dark side directly, in applications that surprised even the Rakata, who had extensive experience with force-based abilities but had not anticipated the particular character of what the Sith tradition could do at its fullest expression. He used the spiritual solidarity of a unified people who were, in a sense, fighting not just for survival but for everything that made them what they were. The war lasted years. It cost the Sith enormously. Valleys that had been inhabited for generations were depopulated. Temples were damaged. The death toll among the Sith was significant enough that the population of certain clans was permanently diminished. Gaps in the bloodlines that would take generations to close. But the Rakata paid as well, more than they had expected to. More than they had paid in most of their previous conquests. And, at some point in the course of the conflict, something shifted. Not on the battlefield, or not only on the battlefield, but in the calculations of the Rakatan commanders who were looking at their losses and their timeline and the stubborn refusal of this red-skinned world and its ancient Dark Lord to simply submit. The Rakata made a decision that was, in retrospect, one of the more significant decisions in the history of the galaxy. They decided to try a different approach. They offered Adas something. Specifically, they offered him knowledge. The Rakata had developed, over their long history of galactic conquest, a technology of extraordinary sophistication. Devices they called holocrons, objects that could store vast amounts of information, including the preserved consciousness or personality matrix of their creators, and transmit that information across time to whoever accessed them with sufficient force sensitivity to unlock their contents. These were not simple data storage. They were living libraries, capable of not merely providing facts, but of teaching and guiding and demonstrating in a way that static records could not. The Rakata offered Adas a holocron containing knowledge of their technology and their practices. The offer was, on the surface, an attempt at negotiation. In practice, it was an attempt to introduce a dependency, to give the Sith something valuable enough that they would be reluctant to continue a war that might end the source of that value. Adas accepted the holocron. He was, by this point in his extraordinarily long life, far too experienced and far too perceptive to believe that the Rakata were giving him anything out of generosity. He understood the calculation they were making. He simply believed, correctly as it turned out, that he could receive the gift and still continue the war, that the knowledge in the holocron would be useful to him regardless of what the Rakata intended it to accomplish. He was right on both counts. The war continued. The Rakata, despite their technology, could not break the Sith resistance, and the losses they were sustaining on Korriban were becoming a problem for their operations elsewhere. Eventually, the Infinite Empire withdrew from Korriban, not in defeat, exactly, or at least not in any version of defeat they would have acknowledged. But they left, and they did not come back. The world remained Sith. The valleys and the mountains and the bone-white cliffs and the tombs of the ancestors remained in the hands of the people who had always lived there. The price of that victory was Adus himself. Accounts differ on exactly how he died. Some say he fell in the final great battle against the Rakatan forces, overwhelmed at last, not by any single enemy, but by the sheer, accumulated weight of what the conflict had cost him. Others say he survived the fighting but did not survive long after it, that a body and a spirit that had sustained 3 centuries of rule and then several years of total war simply reached the end of what was possible. What is agreed upon is that he died victorious. The Rakata were gone. Korriban was free. And the Dark Lord, who had made that freedom possible, was dead. He left behind the holocron the Rakata had given him, now containing his own additions, his own knowledge and technique, layered over the Rakatan foundation. A record of everything he had learned and understood and been. He left behind a unified world. He left behind a people who had survived something that should have destroyed them. And he left behind a title, the Sithari, the perfect being, the ideal toward which his people would orient themselves for the rest of their history, always looking for the next Adus and never quite finding him. The century after Adus died was not a catastrophe. That distinction belongs to many other periods in Sith history. It was something quieter and in its own way more disheartening. It was a slow return to what the Sith had been before Adus arrived and changed things. The clans, which had been unified under his authority for so long that younger generations had no personal memory of anything different, discovered that unity without the specific person who had made it work was a more fragile thing than it had appeared. There was no clear succession. Adus had been so singular in his power and so long-lived that the normal mechanisms of Sith leadership, which involved the strongest available individual claiming authority from the previous holder, had not been exercised in generations. The lords who were powerful enough to make a claim were numerous enough that none of them was obviously dominant over all the others, and so the claims were made and contested. And the contests became conflicts, and the conflicts spread through the clan networks that had been peaceful under Adus and were now seething with ambition and grievance and the particular energy that comes from a people who have just survived an existential war and are not sure what to do with themselves now that the external enemy is gone. The reunification broke, not all at once, and not completely, at least not at first. There were alliances that held. There were regions of Korriban where the peace that Adus had imposed remained durable because the local lords were wise enough or tired enough or frightened enough of what further conflict would cost them to maintain it. But the overall arc was unmistakable. The Sith were drifting back toward their natural equilibrium, which was not peace, but a state of managed tension and periodic violence in which no single authority held the whole world. This period lasted for centuries, longer than Adus had ruled, though it felt different. His reign had felt like a single long, coherent story, with a consistent direction. The post-Adus period felt like a series of overlapping stories that kept interrupting each other and going nowhere in particular. There were strong lords who came close to replicating his achievement. There were individuals of genuine ability who built confederacies that stretched across significant portions of Korriban's territory and held them for long enough to raise children and grandchildren who knew only relative peace. But none of them had what Adus had. None of them had that quality of absolute spiritual authority that the Sith tradition recognized not just as power, but as rightness. The sense that the Force itself was endorsing this particular individual's dominance. Whether this quality was something Adas had genuinely possessed in a unique way, or whether it was something that any sufficiently powerful Sith Lord might theoretically replicate if the conditions were right, was a question the Sith of this period could not answer. They just knew that what they had now was different from what they had had, and that the difference mattered. Korriban in these centuries was not in chaos, but it was diminished. The great projects that had characterized the Adas era, the roads and the expanded temples, and the unified ancestor communion ceremonies, required centralized organization and consistent resource allocation to maintain, and without those things they began to deteriorate. Not rapidly. The Sith built to last. Their temples were carved from living mountain rather than assembled from lighter materials, and the mountain did not crumble on a human timescale. But the maintenance that had kept the roads clear and the temple floors clean and the ceremonial infrastructure functional was an organizational achievement as much as a physical one, and organization was what was lacking now. The sorcerers of the period continued to practice their craft and to develop it in individual ways that kept the spiritual tradition alive and evolving, even without centralized direction. This was perhaps the most important thing about these centuries of fragmentation. The knowledge did not die. The Force sensitivity of the species did not diminish. The deep connection between the Sith people and the dark side of their world, which was the fundamental reality of who they were, continued to be explored and refined and passed down through clan lineages that might be at war with each other on the physical plane, but shared the same basic spiritual heritage. A sorcerer of this period and a sorcerer of the Adas era would have recognized each other as practitioners of the same tradition, despite the centuries between them. The core of what the Sith were remained intact, even as everything built around that core fell into varying degrees of disrepair. And somewhere above their heads, the galaxy continued without them. The Republic grew and expanded. The Jedi Order developed and deepened. Events of extraordinary significance played out on worlds the Sith had never heard of, in languages the Sith had never encountered, between peoples the Sith had no knowledge of. The isolation that had defined Sith existence for as long as their history could reach continued without interruption. Korriban did not know about the galaxy, and the galaxy did not know about Korriban. And in that mutual ignorance, both sides were spared knowledge they were not yet equipped to handle. What ended the isolation was not something the Sith chose, and not something the wider galaxy planned. It was an accident of history that felt, from both sides, like fate. Far away, in the well-mapped and well-governed regions of the Republic, a war had been fought. A group of Jedi had broken from the Order, had explored the dark side in ways the Jedi considered forbidden, had fought their former brothers and sisters for a century and lost. The details of that war are another story entirely, but the ending matters here. The Jedi who had fallen, the Dark Jedi as history would call them, were not executed. The Republic, guided by Jedi principles that valued mercy and rejected killing those who had already surrendered, made what it believed was a compassionate choice. The surviving Dark Jedi were put on ships and exiled, cast into the unknown regions, given minimal supplies and no weapons and instructions to go and not return. The Republic believed this solved the problem. They believed, or wanted to believe, that beings sent into the unknown with nothing would drift and eventually die, that the unknown regions would simply absorb them the way the darkness absorbs anything that enters it without a destination. They were wrong. The ships bearing the exiled Dark Jedi traveled through unknown space for an extended period. Weeks, months. The accounts vary, and none of them come from the Dark Jedi themselves, so the specifics are irrecoverable. What is not disputed is where they ended up. Their ships entered the Horusset system. Their sensors found a planet. The planet was red and ancient and saturated so completely with the dark side of the Force that every Force-sensitive individual aboard those exile ships felt it simultaneously, a pull like nothing they had ever encountered before, a resonance that reached into whatever remained of their Jedi training and said, clearly and without ambiguity, that this was a significant place. They descended. The Dark Jedi, exhausted and resources depleted, and not in a position to be strategically patient, landed on Korriban. And the Sith species, who had felt those ships in the Force long before they became visible in the sky, watched them come down. The moment when the Dark Jedi exiles stepped out onto the surface of Korriban and first encountered the Sith species was a moment that neither side would ever fully recover from. What the Dark Jedi saw was something they had not expected, though in retrospect, it might have been predicted. They had felt the Force saturation of the planet. They had noted the dark side intensity in a way that was impossible to ignore for beings trained, even formally, in Force awareness. But the sight of the Sith people themselves, gathered at a cautious distance from the landing sites, watching the newcomers with those golden and amber eyes that seemed to see further than they should have been able to, was something different. The Dark Jedi had expected primitives. What they found was a civilization of considerable antiquity and its own sophisticated relationship with the Force that was nothing like the Jedi tradition they had grown up in, and nothing like the dark side experiments they had conducted in their years of rebellion, and not like anything they had encountered before at all. The Sith, for their part, felt the Dark Jedi in the Force before they processed anything else about them. And what they felt was power, significant power. Not the absolute overwhelming power of a King Ardas, not the kind of Force presence that reorganized a room around itself, but trained power, controlled power, power that had been shaped and refined and directed with a precision that the Sith tradition, for all its depth, had not developed in the same way, because the Jedi tradition from which these exiles had come had spent thousands of years specifically working on exactly that kind of precision. The Sith sorcerers who gathered to assess the newcomers found themselves in an unusual situation. They could feel that these beings were Force-sensitive. They could feel that the Force in them was oriented toward the dark, which made them in some sense kindred rather than alien. But the character of that Force connection was strange. It had a different texture, a different quality. It had been built through a completely different set of methods and concepts and practices, and the meeting of those two different dark side traditions in that first encounter on the surface of Korriban created a kind of spiritual interference that the more perceptive individuals on both sides found deeply disorienting and deeply interesting in almost equal measure. Among the Dark Jedi exiles, the most powerful was a Junta Pol. He had been, in the days of his rebellion, among the most capable of the Dark Jedi's leaders. He had survived the 100-year darkness. He had survived the exile. He was tired and battle-scarred, and not particularly interested in negotiating from a position of weakness. He understood almost immediately that the situation on Korriban was one that could be managed in a particular way if he was willing to commit to a particular posture. The Sith of this period, without a unifying Dark Lord, without the kind of singular authority that Adas had represented, were in a condition of managed fragmentation. They were not weak, but they were not unified. And a being of Ajuntapal's capabilities and confidence, arriving in a context where every Sith on the planet could feel in the Force that he was powerful, had an option available to him that a less Force-active individual would not have had. He chose presentation over violence. In the initial encounters between the exile group and the Sith clans near the landing sites, Paul used the Force in ways that the Sith had not seen demonstrated before. Not Sith sorcery in its traditional form, but Jedi-derived techniques that the Dark Jedi had adapted and twisted and made their own over a century of rebellion. Lightning and telekinesis and the kind of direct Force assault that could stop a charging warrior mid-stride and hold them suspended in the air. Paul demonstrated this. He demonstrated it with the calm efficiency of someone who had done exactly this kind of thing for a very long time and had no need to be dramatic about it because the facts were dramatic enough on their own. The Sith watched. They felt it in the Force. The sorcerers among them, the most sensitive and most perceptive, exchanged looks and private communications that amounted to this is real. This is significant. This is something that changes the calculation. What followed the initial demonstration was not immediate submission. The Sith were not a people who submitted immediately. They were a people who assessed, who watched and measured and probed for weakness, who tested strength through the application of enough counterpressure to see whether the strength held. Paul expected this. He had been told nothing about the Sith species before arriving on their world because no one in the Republic or the Jedi Order had known they existed. But he understood power and the dynamics around power in a way that his long experience in the dark side tradition had made almost instinctive. He held firm through the testing. He demonstrated consistency in his capabilities when challenged. And gradually, across weeks of encounter and standoff and careful negotiation conducted in the absence of any shared language, through Force perception and gesture and the slow mutual development of basic communication, the relationship between the Dark Jedi exiles and the Sith clans of Korriban began to take a shape that would define everything that came after. The Sith sorcerers interpreted the arrival of the Dark Jedi through the framework of their own tradition, which told them that exceptional Force power was exceptional for a reason, that the dark side did not simply manifest this way without purpose. There were, among the Sith, surviving traditions of prophecy, oral histories, and preserved sorcerer visions that spoke of a time when beings of great power would come from outside, beings whose darkness was real but whose form was strange, and that the meeting of the old power and the new would produce something that would outlast both of them. Whether these traditions genuinely predated the arrival of the Dark Jedi, or whether they were constructed after the fact to provide a narrative framework for something that had happened without warning, is a question that cannot be resolved from this distance. What matters is that the framework existed, or came to exist, and that within it, the Dark Jedi were not simply invaders or conquerors, but something more complicated. They were integrated into a story the Sith had already been telling themselves, inserted into a mythology in a way that made their presence feel inevitable rather than accidental. Ajunta Pal allowed this, more than allowed it. He encouraged it. He was not, whatever else he was, a man who failed to understand the usefulness of religious legitimacy. He had spent a century fighting a war in which his side had been branded heretics and criminals and threats to the order of the galaxy. He understood what it meant to have the ideological framing of a conflict work against you. Here on Korriban, the ideological framing was moving in his favor for the first time in a very long time, and he was not about to waste it. The Dark Jedi took the role the Sith framework offered them. They became, within the mythology that was developing around their arrival, the next expression of the dark side's will. The ones who had come from beyond the sky because the Force itself had sent them. The heirs of something Adus had begun and not quite finished. This was not entirely dishonest, in the strange way that things that are completely self-serving can sometimes also be true. Pal and his people were genuinely of the dark side. Their connection to it was genuine. Their capabilities were genuine, and the fact of their arrival on the world, the dark side, had most thoroughly claimed in the known galaxy, was a strange enough coincidence to invite exactly the kind of interpretation the Sith tradition placed on it. They settled. The Dark Jedi exiles did not establish a camp or a temporary base. They established residences. They began to build. The tombs and the temple structures that already existed on Korriban provided architectural context. And the Dark Jedi, drawing on a tradition that included considerable knowledge of Force-imbued construction, contributed their own techniques and aesthetics to the built environment of the planet. Korriban began to look different. The additions the Dark Jedi made were recognizable as additions, carried a different quality than the ancient Sith stonework they stood alongside. But they were not alien. They were, strangely, compatible, as if the dark side that had shaped the original Sith architecture and the dark side that had shaped the Jedi-derived aesthetics of the exiles were drawing from the same well at different depths and producing different expressions of the same fundamental impulse. The interbreeding began gradually. It was not at first a policy or a program or something consciously decided. It happened the way things happen when two groups of beings share a world and understand each other's power and find themselves in the strange position of being, for the first time in a long time, in the presence of people who are genuinely capable of appreciating what they are. Among the Sith sorcerers, those who were most perceptive in the Force, those whose sensitivity was deepest and whose understanding of dark side tradition was most sophisticated, the Dark Jedi exiles were not simply conquerors or newcomers. They were the most interesting people the sorcerers had ever met. The Dark Jedi felt something similar about the Sith sorcerers. These were beings who had reached deep into the dark side through entirely different means and arrived at genuinely novel places, who knew things about the Force's dark nature that no Jedi or ex-Jedi had ever figured out, because no Jedi had ever lived on Korriban or grown up in a tradition that treated the dark side as the simple and primary reality of existence, rather than as a seductive trap to be avoided. The exchange of knowledge began as something like mutual fascination. Sorcerers and Dark Jedi, spending time together, demonstrating techniques, attempting to communicate what those techniques were doing in the Force, and how they worked, and where they had come from. This required developing shared language. And developing shared language required exactly the kind of sustained proximity and collaborative effort that tends, over time, to produce other kinds of intimacy as well. The first mixed heritage children were born on Korriban within a generation of the exiles' arrival. They were remarkable in ways that surprised both parent communities. The combination of Sith species' natural force saturation, that deep connection to the dark side that ran through every cell of their biology, with the trained and refined force sensitivity of the dark Jedi lineage, produced offspring whose capabilities exceeded either parent tradition's predictions. A child born to a Sith sorcerer of genuine power and a dark Jedi exile of significant ability was not simply the average of the two. They were something new, something that the dark side seemed to reach toward with a particular intensity, as if the combination itself was producing individuals the Force had a specific interest in. These hybrid children were valued immediately by both communities in different ways. The Dark Jedi saw in them the potential for a new generation of dark side practitioners who would be stronger and more capable than anything the Jedi Order had ever had to deal with. The Sith sorcerers saw in them validation of everything their tradition had told them about the significance of the Dark Jedi's arrival. The children were raised within a merged culture that began to form around them, combining elements of both traditions, keeping what was most powerful from each, discarding or subordinating what was less essential. The title of Sith Lord was applied to the Dark Jedi leaders from early in this process. It was a Sith title from the Sith tradition, but it was being given to people who were human in their origins, who had come from outside. This was significant. It was the first sign of something that would play out over many centuries with enormous consequences. The Sith tradition, the title, the framework, was becoming separable from the species that had created it. The word was beginning to migrate, and the original people whose word it was were, almost imperceptibly at first, beginning to become something other than the primary holders of their own heritage. In the early centuries after the Dark Jedi arrived, this development was not yet a crisis or even a concern. The pure-blooded Sith, the individuals of the original species without admixture from the exile population, remained the majority of Korriban's population. Their clan structures remained intact. Their sorcerous traditions remained the foundation of what the merged culture called Sith practice. The Dark Jedi who had arrived were a small group, no more than a few dozen individuals. And even with the children they produced, the hybrid population was far smaller than the original species population for several generations. The structure that emerged in this early period was one of layered hierarchy with the Dark Jedi at the top, their hybrid children beneath them, and the original Sith clan members filling the broad base of a society that had always been organized around the principle that the most powerful led and everyone else followed in proportion to their distance from the top. This was not entirely alien to Sith values. Their tradition had always honored strength and structured itself around it. The Dark Jedi were demonstrably the strongest Force users on the planet. Their hybrids, the most promising of the next generation. That the hierarchy should place them at the top was consistent with how Sith civilization had always organized itself. What was different was who occupied which position. The original Sith had always assumed that the strongest among themselves would lead. The idea that the strongest might be someone who was not quite Sith in the original sense, or not Sith at all in the biological sense, was a new configuration. And it was a configuration that, once established, began to compound. The Dark Jedi leaders, and then the strongest of their hybrid descendants, were the ones who directed the expansion of Sith civilization beyond Korriban. The planet had always been the center of Sith existence, But it was a relatively small world with limited resources, and the new leadership had different ambitions than the clan lords of the pre-arrival era. They looked outward. They had come from a galaxy they knew to be vast and full of worlds, and the isolation that had defined Sith existence was, to them, not a natural condition of the species, but simply a circumstance that could be changed. The expansion to Ziost was the first major step. Ziost was a cold world, frigid and dark. Its skies perpetually overcast in ways that gave it a quality of permanent twilight that suited the Sith aesthetic better than any warmer or more hospitable environment would have. It became the second major center of what was now being called, explicitly and without qualification, the Sith Empire. The designation was significant. It was the language of the Dark Jedi tradition, the framework of an empire as a political structure, with an emperor at its peak and a hierarchy of subordinate lords beneath, applied to what had been a collection of clan territories governed by the most powerful sorcerer available. The Sith species embraced the designation because it matched their values in surface ways. It emphasized hierarchy and power and the subordination of the weak to the strong. But the term empire carried with it implications of scale and ambition that the original Sith tradition had not particularly emphasized. The original Sith had not dreamed of conquering the galaxy. They had dreamed of dominance on their world, of being the strongest clan, of having their lord recognized as the preeminent being in the Force by all the others on Korriban. The Dark Jedi, who had lived their entire formative lives in a galaxy-spanning civilization and had fought a war against that civilization and lost, dreamed of something much larger. And it was their dreams that the Sith Empire was going to pursue. The expansion that followed the establishment of Ziost as a second capital was gradual but consistent. The Sith Lords, who were increasingly hybrids or humans with deep ties to the Dark Jedi exile lineage, rather than pure-blooded members of the original species, claimed new worlds in the regions of space surrounding Korriban's system. Not all of these worlds were hospitable. The Sith were not looking for hospitable worlds in the sense that a colonizing civilization seeking agricultural land or resources might mean it. They were looking for worlds where the Force was strong, where the dark side could be reached with ease, where temples could be built, and the power of the dark side could be accumulated and concentrated. Many of the worlds, they claimed, were harsh in exactly the ways that Korriban was harsh. Cold, dark, geologically violent, Force active, in ways that made them uncomfortable for beings not already attuned to the dark side. This was not a problem for the Sith, it was a feature. Among the Sith Lords of this expansion era, certain names stand above the rest. Tulak Hord is perhaps the most consistently recorded of the great conquerors of the early Empire period. He was a master of lightsaber combat in a tradition that the Dark Jedi had brought to Korriban, and that had been merged with the physically powerful fighting styles that Sith tradition had already developed. He was also a formidable dark side practitioner in the full merged tradition. Not a pure sorcerer of the old school, but a complete warrior sorcerer of the new synthesis that the merger of the two cultures had produced. Hord extended Sith territory to worlds that had not previously been part of any Sith domain. His campaigns were conducted with a ferocity that even by Sith standards was notable. He did not offer the worlds he targeted the choice between submission and destruction in any meaningful sense. He offered them destruction in either case, with the distinction being whether the destruction came quickly or slowly. Worlds that submitted immediately were absorbed into the empire with their populations intact, enslaved, and used but alive. Worlds that resisted were made examples of in ways that subsequent targets found convincing. Under Horde and the lords who followed him, the Sith Empire developed the characteristics that would define it for millennia. Its capital alternated between Korriban and Ziost, depending on political circumstances. Its military was built on the foundation of dark side ability, with the most powerful Force users at its peak and conventional soldiers beneath them, their role being to do the work that Force powers alone could not accomplish, and to die in the quantities that war required without depleting the irreplaceable supply of Force-sensitive warriors. Its governance was a hierarchy of dominance in which every being in the Empire understood their position relative to every other being. And that position was ultimately determined by Force strength. The slavery that had existed in Sith civilization before the Dark Jedi arrived was formalized and expanded. The conquered populations of the worlds the Empire claimed became a labor force of enormous scale. They built the temples and the academies and the fortifications that the Sith Empire needed. They mined the resources that kept the military operating. They provided subjects for the experiments in Sith alchemy and dark side technique that were one of the Empire's most important ongoing activities, experiments that did not always leave the subjects intact or alive or recognizably themselves. The pure-blooded Sith, the original species, members who had not been part of any hybrid lineage, occupied a complicated position in this empire at its height. They were the people of the founding world. They were the biological origin of the tradition that the Empire considered its own. Their sorcerous lineages were old and deep, and held knowledge that the hybrid lords sometimes could not replicate, because it had been passed down through Sith clan traditions for so many generations that it had become inseparable from the biology of the species that carried it. But they were not at the top. They had not been at the top since the Dark Jedi arrived, and the decades had become generations, and the generations had become centuries, and the original configuration of the species as the dominant population had been eroded by the expansion of the hybrid lineages and the sheer scale of the Empire's territorial growth. The Empire was no longer a Korriban phenomenon. It was a multi-world civilization, and Korriban was its most sacred ground rather than its administrative center, which was a different thing. The pure-blooded Sith who lived in this empire were honored. Their heritage was honored. The title and the tradition were explicitly traced back to them, and no Dark Lord of this era would have denied that the Sith species were the root of everything the Empire claimed to be. But honored and empowered are different things. And the original people of the Empire's founding world were, as the Empire reached what its lords believed was its golden age, honored in the way that the founding of something great is honored while the current inheritors of that greatness take the leading roles. It was a civilizational transformation that no single decision had produced. It was the accumulated weight of centuries of choices, each of which made a kind of sense within its own context, each of which moved in the same direction, each of which brought the original Sith species one step further from the center of the civilization that bore their name, and outside the borders of the Empire, in the well-lit corridors of the Republic that the Sith Lords dreamed of one day conquering. No one knew any of this was happening at all. There is a particular kind of tragedy that has no single moment of collapse, no battle lost, no city burned, no treaty signed in defeat, that marks the precise instant when something that was ends and what remains begins. Some things end slowly, across centuries, in increments too small to measure on any individual day, through the accumulation of pressures that are each, in themselves, survivable, but that together, over long enough time, reshape a people into something their ancestors would not have recognized. The original Sith species did not die quickly. They did not die easily. They did not die in a single catastrophe that future historians could point to and say, "There, that is when it happened." They died slowly, across millennia, in ways that were sometimes violent and sometimes not violent at all, sometimes the product of direct external force, and sometimes simply the consequence of a world changing around them faster than they could change within it. This is the second part of their story, and it is the part that contains the darkest chapters. For the first centuries after the Dark Jedi exiles arrived and the merger of cultures began, the Sith Empire, as it expanded outward, was genuinely a civilization that honored the original species at its foundation. The tombs on Korriban were sacred, not merely as rhetorical gestures, but as living spiritual centers that the entire empire organized itself around. The great lords of the pure blood lineages held positions of genuine authority within the hierarchy of Sith society. When a Dark Lord of the Sith traced their spiritual legitimacy, when they explained why their claim to the title was valid and what heritage they were drawing on, the name they invoked was the Sith species, the ancient bloodlines. The original communion with the dark side that had predated any Jedi falling from grace or any exile ship crossing into unknown space. There was, in the early Sith Empire, a real and functional reverence for the source from which everything had grown. And the pure-blooded Sith who lived within this empire, who served in its temples and its academies and its military and its government, understood themselves to be the inheritors and custodians of something irreplaceable. They were the root. Everything else was the tree that had grown from them. This was their self-understanding. And in the early centuries of the empire, the world around them largely confirmed it. But time is the great editor of all arrangements. What seems permanent in one generation reveals itself as contingent in the next, and what is contingent in the second generation becomes memory in the fifth, and memory in the fifth generation becomes mythology in the 10th. And mythology can be claimed by anyone with sufficient conviction and sufficient power to enforce the claim. The Dark Jedi who had arrived on Korriban were human. Their hybrid children were partly human. Their hybrid grandchildren were more distantly Sith in the biological sense, but were often more powerful in the Force than their purer-blooded contemporaries, because the combination of the two traditions had a tendency to produce individuals of exceptional capability in ways that were not entirely predictable, but were consistent enough to be noted and understood. The Empire was a meritocracy of darkness. Its organizing principle was force strength, always and in every generation. And the Force did not distribute itself according to the preferences of the pure-blooded Sith for it to remain concentrated among themselves. It went where it went. It appeared in the hybrid children with a frequency and an intensity that made arguments for pure blood exclusivity harder to maintain in practice than they were to assert in principle. The lords who held the highest positions in the Sith Empire in the 3rd and 4th and 5th centuries after the Dark Jedi arrived were mostly hybrids. By the 6th and 7th centuries, many of the most powerful were humans who had been born into Sith space and trained in the merged tradition, but carried no Sith species blood at all. This was not a conspiracy. It was not the product of any deliberate policy to displace the original people. It was the natural consequence of an organizing principle. Force, strength, above all, applied consistently over a long enough period in a civilization that was rapidly expanding and constantly incorporating new elements into itself. The pure-blooded Sith did not disappear from positions of authority. They held seats on whatever governing councils existed in a given era. They commanded forces, led academies, maintained the temple complexes on Korriban and Ziost and the other worlds that the Empire had claimed. But the ratio shifted. What had begun as a situation in which pure-blooded Sith were the majority of the Empire's force-sensitive population and held most of its leadership positions became, gradually and then more rapidly, a situation in which they were a distinguished minority whose heritage was honored in language, while the actual exercise of highest authority passed more and more frequently to those who were human or hybrid, and the pure-blooded Sith, who were perceptive enough to notice this, who could measure the difference between what was said about their importance and what was done with their importance, felt something that their tradition gave them no good framework for processing. Not quite grief, because grief requires the clear loss of something that was present. Not quite anger, because anger requires an identifiable target and a specific wrong. Something slower and more diffuse and harder to name. The sense that the world was moving around them in a direction they had not chosen and could not reverse. The Empire in its golden age was a formidable construction. Whatever the internal dynamics of status and lineage that troubled the pure-blooded Sith, the civilization as a whole had achieved things that were genuinely impressive in the terms that the dark side tradition valued. The Sith academies trained generations of Force users in techniques that the Republic and the Jedi, who remained entirely unaware of the Empire's existence for most of this period, would not have been able to counter without extraordinary effort. The dark side knowledge accumulated in the holocrons and the great libraries of the Sith Empire represented millennia of sustained inquiry into the Force's darker nature. Building on the foundation the original Sith sorcerers had laid through their own long practice, and extending it in directions that the sorcerers of Korriban's early clan period could not have imagined. Sith alchemy had developed into a discipline of extraordinary sophistication and extraordinary horror. The creation of new life forms through the application of dark side energy to biological substrate. The reshaping of existing creatures into things that were living weapons, twisted into new configurations that bore only distant resemblance to whatever they had originally been. The preservation of consciousness after death, at least in the partial and troubled forms that the dark side permitted, so that the great lords whose physical bodies failed could leave something of themselves behind in the tombs and temples they built to house their ending. The Sith Empire, built on Korriban, a monument to itself that was meant to last forever. Tomb after massive tomb carved into the blood-red mountains, each one the final resting place of a lord whose power had been extraordinary enough to warrant permanent commemoration. The Valley of the Dark Lords, as it came to be called in later ages, was one of the most concentrated accumulations of dark side energy in the galaxy. Each successive entombment adding to the total weight of what the place contained, layer on layer of preserved presence building over centuries into something that felt, to any Force-sensitive being who entered it, like standing inside the dark side itself, made architectural. This was the Empire's greatest achievement, and its most sincere expression of what it valued. Not the military conquests, or the slave populations, or the wealth extracted from the worlds it controlled, but this, the permanent record in stone and force and preserved darkness of every great lord who had ever served the tradition. It was, in its way, a continuation of what the original Sith species had always done on Korriban. The ancestor communion, the tombs as temples, the dead as ongoing participants in the life of the living. The Dark Jedi had taken this practice from the people who had taught it to them and had made it enormous, had turned the intimate clan-scale ritual of consulting the honored dead into an imperial institution that shaped the entire civilization. There was something almost touching about this, if you chose to look at it from a particular angle. The conquerors had been conquered by the conquered in a way that neither side had fully recognized. The Sith species' deepest values had become the Sith Empire's deepest values. The people had been displaced from the center of their own tradition, but the tradition itself had won. It had absorbed everything the Dark Jedi brought to it and had remained, in its essential character, a Sith tradition in the deepest sense of what that word once meant. The Dark Lord Marka Ragnos ruled the Sith Empire at the height of its power, in the centuries before anyone from the Republic ever stumbled into Sith space and changed everything. He is remembered as one of the greatest of the Sith Lords, an individual whose mastery of dark side techniques was comprehensive in a way that few had achieved before him and fewer still would after. Ragnos was not a pure-blooded Sith in the original species sense. His lineage was hybrid, complex, the product of so many generations of interbreeding between the exiled descendants and the original Sith bloodlines that precisely categorizing his heritage was more of a historical exercise than a practical one. But he was Sith in every sense that the Empire had come to recognize as meaningful. His connection to the dark side was profound. His authority over the Empire's hierarchy was absolute, and his reign was one of stability and consolidation that the Sith Empire badly needed after several previous eras of internal conflict and succession struggles. Under Ragnos, the Empire was at relative peace with itself. Not because conflict was absent from Sith society, which would have been unnatural and undesirable in their framework, but because the conflict was managed, channeled, directed toward purposes that strengthened the Empire rather than fracturing it. The pure-blooded Sith who served under Ragnos did so in a context where their heritage was explicitly honored, where the ancient bloodlines of Korriban were invoked as the foundation of everything the Empire claimed to be. Ragnos himself made a point of this. He understood, with the long historical perspective that genuine wisdom provides, that an empire which forgot its foundations did not last. He knew that the original Sith species were the foundation, and so he honored them. They were not at the top, but they were not forgotten. They had visible roles, meaningful positions, a presence in the public life of the civilization that made the connection between the Empire and its oldest roots legible to anyone who cared to look. When Ragnos died, at an advanced age, and in circumstances that made clear, even as it was happening, that an era was ending, the question of succession revealed exactly the tensions that his long, stable reign had managed to contain without resolving. Two powerful Sith Lords stepped forward to claim his position. Naga Sadow, brilliant and ambitious, and willing to take risks that more cautious individuals considered insane. And Ludo Kresh, conservative and strategic, and possessed of a deep instinct for self-preservation that expressed itself as opposition to the recklessness he saw in his rival. The argument between them was, on the surface, about whether to engage with the Republic ships that had accidentally found their way into Sith space, whether the arrival of the two explorers represented an opportunity or a threat, whether the correct response was expansion and conquest, or caution and consolidation. But underneath that argument was a deeper one about what the Sith Empire was for and what it was willing to risk to become what it dreamed of being. Sado believed the Empire had been too long in the shadows, that its strength was real and its enemies were weak, and the galaxy was waiting to be taken. Kresh believed that the Empire's strength was exactly what needed to be protected, that gambling it on an invasion of a republic whose actual capabilities were unknown was the kind of overconfidence that ended civilizations. Both of them were right about something. Neither of them was right about enough. What followed from Sado's seizure of power and his decision to launch his invasion of Republic space is, in galactic historical terms, one of the best documented sequences of events from this entire ancient period. The Great Hyperspace War, as it is called, the first direct confrontation between the Sith Empire and the Galactic Republic, has been studied and written about by historians across countless generations because its consequences were so vast and so long-lasting that understanding it feels essential to understanding everything that came after. But most of those histories are told from the perspective of the Republic and the Jedi, from the vantage point of the beings who won. What is less often told, less carefully reconstructed, is what the Great Hyperspace War meant for the original Sith species. What it cost them specifically, what it destroyed that was irreplaceable and would never be rebuilt. The invasion Sado launched was the largest military operation the Sith Empire had ever mounted. It deployed the full weight of the Empire's accumulated centuries of strength, its fleets and its armies and its dark side practitioners, in a coordinated strike against multiple Republic worlds simultaneously. For a brief period, it appeared to be working. The Republic, which had not known the Sith existed, had no prepared defense against an assault. Conducted partly with conventional military force and partly with Sith sorcery of a kind their defenders had never encountered and had no counters for. Panic spread. Worlds fell. The illusions that Sado wove from his meditation sphere, multiplying the apparent size of the Sith forces, pushed Republic defenders to the edge of collapse. For a moment, the long dream of the Dark Jedi exiles and their descendants, the reconquest of the galaxy that had cast them out, seemed not merely possible but inevitable. And then it came apart. Sado's battle meditation required sustained concentration, and the concentration was broken by the actions of the Daragon siblings, the two Republic explorers whose accidental arrival in Sith space had triggered the entire sequence of events. When the concentration broke, the illusions dissolved, and Republic defenders who had believed themselves hopelessly outnumbered discovered the reality of the forces they actually faced. The tide turned. Sith fleets that had been advancing began retreating. Republic forces rallied. Kresh, who had survived Sado's earlier attempt to eliminate him, seized the opportunity to attack Sado's rear positions with what remained of his own faction's forces. The Sith invasion collapsed into a retreat, and the retreat became a rout, and the Republic forces that pursued the retreating Sith did not stop at the border of Sith space. They came in. They came in with the full force of a civilization that had been attacked without warning and was now operating from the combined motivation of genuine military necessity and justified fury at what had been done to them. The Republic's counter-assault on the Sith homeworlds was overwhelming. Korriban, the sacred heart of everything the Sith Empire had been for thousands of years, fell to Republic forces. The cities and academies and temples that had stood for centuries, the places where the pure-blooded Sith had maintained their deepest traditions and their most sacred practices, were attacked and in many cases destroyed. The great libraries that had housed accumulated millennia of dark side knowledge were targeted specifically because the Jedi who accompanied the Republic forces understood correctly that the knowledge in those libraries was a threat that would persist long after any military force was defeated. Texts and holocrons were seized. Those that the Jedi could not secure were destroyed on the spot. The tombs were not looted in the traditional sense, because the dark side energy that suffused them made entering them a risky proposition even for Jedi of significant ability, and the bodies of the ancient lords were not disturbed if there was nothing militarily useful in their vicinity. But the living Sith, the pure-blooded members of the original species who had been living on Korriban and the other Sith homeworlds when the Republic arrived, had nowhere to go. They could not evacuate quickly enough. They could not organize effective resistance with the Empire's military forces in disarray, and much of the leadership either dead or in flight. What happened to the pure-blooded Sith of the Sith homeworlds during the Republic's counter-assault was not a deliberate genocide in the sense of a systematic plan to exterminate a species. The Republic was not that. The Jedi were not that. But the destruction of a civilization and its infrastructure, the killing of those who fought back, the capture of those who surrendered, and the disruption of the supply systems and the social structures that had sustained a population produce casualties that accumulate rapidly, regardless of whether anyone intended them. The pure-blooded Sith population of Korriban was reduced dramatically during the Great Hyperspace War and its immediate aftermath. How dramatically is impossible to state with precision from this distance in time, but the accounts that survive from the period speak of the near-complete depopulation of significant areas of the planet, of the loss of bloodlines that had been maintained for centuries, of a disruption to the demographic continuity of the species that was not simply a military setback, but an existential wound. What had been a civilization's worth of people living in the valleys and the mountain-carved temples and the ancient clan territories of Korriban was, by the time the Republic forces withdrew, something much smaller and much more desperate. Naga Sado himself escaped the final disaster. He gathered a handful of loyal followers, the Massassi warriors who had served as the elite fighting force of the Sith Empire, and who were, in their own right, a distinct lineage connected to the broader Sith species tradition, and he fled to the remote jungle moon of Yavin 4. There he entered a state of suspended animation, preserved by the dark side techniques he had spent his life mastering, waiting in the dark for a future that would never arrive in the form he imagined. The Massassi he left behind on Yavin 4 built temples for him, maintained the site, continued to exist in the isolation of that jungle moon for thousands of years, their culture gradually changing in ways that reflected the absence of the guiding tradition that had shaped them, becoming something stranger and more feral than the Sith Empire they had been born into. They were an echo, a remnant, a branch cut from the tree, surviving in its own fashion but no longer connected to the living organism that had given it form. On the Sith homeworlds themselves, survival took many forms. Some pure-blooded Sith went into hiding in the most remote and inaccessible regions of Korriban, in places where the Republic forces either did not look or found too dangerous to pursue. They understood the valley terrain as the outsiders did not, knew the hidden places, the deep passages in the mountains, the areas where the dark side ran so fiercely through the ground that entering them without the specific attunement the Sith species had developed over generations was simply inadvisable. They survived in those hidden places, in small groups, in conditions of profound hardship, maintaining what they could of their traditions and their knowledge in circumstances that made systematic practice nearly impossible. Others scattered. They left Korriban and the other homeworlds entirely, moving outward into the wider galaxy in all directions, taking whatever they could carry and going wherever the Republic's attention was not focused. Some ended up in the Outer Rim, on worlds whose insignificance was their best protection. Some ended up in places that already had dark side traditions, small communities of force-sensitive beings on the margins of galactic civilization who recognized something in the arriving Sith refugees and were willing to provide shelter in exchange for the knowledge those refugees carried. Some found their way to worlds so far from any Republic presence that they could effectively disappear into the landscape and live out their lives without anyone knowing what they were or where they had come from. These scattered survivors were not a unified community. They could not be. The distances between them and the disruption of the communication and travel infrastructure that had connected Sith space were too great. They were individuals and small families, and tiny groups carrying fragments of a shattered whole, each fragment containing part of the pattern, but no single fragment containing enough of the pattern to reconstruct the whole on its own. The great tradition of the Sith species, the ancient deep communion with the dark side that had been developing on Korriban for as long as the species had been there, fractured in the aftermath of the Great Hyperspace War into 1,000 small pieces scattered across the galaxy with no mechanism to bring them back together. And the wider galaxy, the Republic and the Jedi Order, believed that in winning the war they had ended the Sith completely, permanently. They did not know about the scattered survivors. They did not know about the hidden communities on the remote margins of the Outer Rim. They did not know, because they could not have known, that what they had destroyed was the Empire, but not the people, the institution, but not the root. The survivors of the Sith species persisted, quietly and largely invisibly, in the centuries that followed. They did not build new empires. They did not launch new invasions. They lacked the numbers and the resources and the organizational capacity to do anything on that scale. What they did was survive, and in surviving they preserved, imperfectly and incompletely, but genuinely, something of what they had been. Among the things they preserved was the knowledge, the dark side traditions of the Sith species, the specific character of their relationship with the Force that had been shaped by thousands of years of living on Korriban and hundreds of years of merging with the dark Jedi tradition did not entirely vanish with the fall of the Empire. It survived in the holocrons that had been carried away before the Republic forces arrived, in the memory of the sorcerers who had escaped, in the oral traditions of the hidden communities that maintained whatever practices they could sustain without the infrastructure of a functioning civilization to support them. The knowledge was degraded by its conditions. When traditions that were designed to be taught systematically in dedicated academies by experienced masters to students who had years to devote to nothing else, are instead transmitted in hiding by survivors to children who are also trying to maintain basic existence, things are lost. Nuance is lost first, then context. Then the understanding of why a particular technique works the way it does, leaving only the technique itself increasingly divorced from the framework that explained it. What persisted in the scattered communities of Sith species, survivors in the centuries after the Great Hyperspace War, was a tradition that was genuine in its connection to the original practice, but impoverished in its depth. A river that had been diverted into 100 small streams, each of which reached the sea, but none of which carried the full volume and force of the original. This was the condition of the Sith species for several hundred years. Scattered, diminished, hidden, slowly forgetting things that no living individual was left who remembered well enough to teach. On Korriban itself, the survivors who had remained hidden in the mountain fastnesses and the deep passages continued their own practice in isolation. The planet was not permanently occupied by the Republic. There was no particular reason to maintain a sustained military presence on a world whose value, outside of its significance to the defeated Sith, was minimal by Republic standards. It was a harsh and inhospitable place that produced nothing the Republic needed, and whose dark side saturation made it actively unpleasant to any Force-sensitive individual who was oriented toward the light. The Republic withdrew its forces once it was satisfied that no significant organized Sith presence remained active. What it left behind in the valleys was the ruins of everything the Sith Empire had built, the broken temples, and the great untouched tombs, and the valleys full of the accumulated dark side energy of centuries of powerful and passionate deaths. And in the hidden places, the small communities of survivors, too few to reconstitute what had been but too resilient to simply cease to exist. The centuries passed. The Sith species endured in their reduced and scattered condition through a period that galactic history, focused on the Republic and the Jedi, and the great events of the known world, largely ignores. It is a period without drama in the external sense, without battles or discoveries or the kind of individuals whose names become famous. It is a period of quiet persistence, of a people doing the most fundamental thing any people can do, continuing to be. The pure-blooded Sith of this era were not the same as their ancestors of the Imperial period. How could they be? They had been through too much. The catastrophe of the Great Hyperspace War and its aftermath had reshaped them in ways both practical and psychological. The practical reshaping was simple and brutal. Smaller populations in worse conditions, with fewer resources and less organizational support for the preservation of their traditions. The psychological reshaping was more complex. A people who had understood themselves as the foundation of the greatest dark side civilization in galactic history, as the root from which an empire had grown, and whose heritage gave that empire its most fundamental identity, now understood themselves as survivors of something that no longer existed. This was not a small shift in self-understanding. It was the difference between being the center and being the margin. And the way a people understands its own position in the world shapes everything about how it exists in that world. What it values, what it fears, what it expects of itself, and of the forces that surround it. The communities of Sith species, survivors in this long, quiet period after the Great Hyperspace War, were not broken. That would be too simple a description, and also too final, implying an endpoint that had not arrived. They were changed, smaller in their ambitions, more careful in their practice, more conscious of their own fragility and of the need to protect what remained of who they were without the protections that a functioning civilization provides. They were also, in some ways, purer in their tradition than the Empire's Sith species population had been. Because the elements of the tradition that had come from outside, the Dark Jedi frameworks, and the Imperial hierarchies and the galaxy-spanning ambitions that had been layered over the original Korriban practice had been stripped away by the catastrophe. What remained was older, more direct. The simple and ancient relationship between a people and the dark side of the world they had grown on, maintained in conditions that stripped away all the complexity that centuries of imperial elaboration had added. There is something almost paradoxical about this. The defeat that scattered the Sith species and broke their civilization also, in the places where the tradition survived most directly, freed it from certain distortions. The original Sith magic, the ancestor communion, and the clan sorcery, and the deep attunement to Korriban's particular dark side character persisted more cleanly in the hidden communities than it had in the great academies of the Empire, which had been so much more interested in the applications of power than in the fundamental relationship with the Force that made power possible. Far away from these hidden communities, in the unknown regions where no Republic explorer had ever gone, something else was happening. A Sith Lord who had refused to participate in Naga Sado's invasion, who had watched the great hyperspace war from a careful distance and used the chaos of its aftermath with extraordinary cunning, was doing something that would eventually shape the fate of the Sith species more profoundly than any event since the Dark Jedi's original arrival on Korriban. He is known to history by many names: Vitiate, Valkorion, the Sith Emperor. But at the beginning of the story that ended up consuming an entire world and reshaping the galaxy for 1,000 years, he was simply a Sith Lord of human lineage and extraordinary force ability, the product of a particularly troubled childhood on a world called Medriaz, raised in circumstances of extraordinary cruelty that turned what might have been exceptional force sensitivity into something closer to a fundamental orientation toward consumption and domination. He was not pure-blooded Sith. He was human in his species, though by the time of the events that made him famous, he was something that made the designation of any particular species feel inadequate. A being who had moved so far beyond the normal parameters of what any mortal creature could be, that the categories applied to mortals no longer quite fit. Before the Great Hyperspace War, he had gathered Sith survivors to a world called Nathima. He had promised them unity, promised them that a ritual could be performed that would give them power enough to defeat the Republic and the Jedi and reclaim what the Empire had lost. 8,000 Sith Lords had come to Nathima. They had come because they were desperate, and because Vitiate's reputation for dark side mastery was genuine, and because the alternative to hoping he could deliver on his promise was simply waiting for the Republic to find them and finish what the war had started. What actually happened on Nathima was not a ritual of collective power. It was a ritual of consumption. Vitiate used the assembled 8,000 Sith Lords as fuel. He drew their life energy, their force connection, everything that made them what they were, into himself, in an act that took not hours but years of sustained effort to accomplish fully, years in which the victims were already bound and could not escape and could not resist and could do nothing but experience the slow dissolution of everything they had been. When it was done, Nathema was empty. Not merely depopulated in the sense that the beings who had lived there were dead, empty in a different and more absolute sense. The Force itself had been stripped from the planet. The connection between the living world and the energy field that surrounded and permeated all life had been severed, so completely and so permanently that Nathema became a place where Force-sensitive beings could not sense the Force at all, where the absence of that connection produced in anyone who felt it a kind of psychological horror that was difficult to describe and impossible to become accustomed to. And Vitiate had consumed those 8,000 Sith Lords, most of them of the Empire's more powerful lineages, most of them individuals whose Force sensitivity and dark side mastery represented the concentrated inheritance of centuries of Sith tradition. They were gone in a way that nothing could undo, and among them, inevitably, were Sith of pure blood lineage. Not the scattered survivors of the home worlds who were too dispersed and too hidden to have received Vitiate's summons in most cases, but Sith, lords of Sith species ancestry, who had been part of the Empire's hierarchy and had answered what seemed like the last hope of their civilization. They died on Nathema for a cause that was not what they had been told it was. They died to make one being immortal, and the tradition and the knowledge and the bloodlines they carried died with them. Vitiate, now possessing an immortality he had purchased at an incomprehensible price, led the survivors of the Sith, who had not gone to Nathema, the ones who were too peripheral or too suspicious or simply too far away to have received the summons in time, on a 20-year journey through the unknown regions to Dromund Kaas. There, in the perpetual storms of a world saturated with the dark side, he built a new Sith Empire. And the Sith species who survived in the scattered communities of the broader galaxy, on Korriban and in the Outer Rim, and in the 100 small places where the catastrophe had deposited them, were not part of this project. They were not invited. They were not consulted. The new empire that rose on Dromund Kaas was Vitiate's creation, organized entirely around his will and his long-term purpose, which was not the preservation of the Sith tradition in any recognizable sense, but the eventual consumption of all life in the galaxy on the model of what he had done to Nathema. The Sith species as a biological and cultural entity were, from the perspective of Vitiate's project, simply not relevant. They were not necessary to his plan. They were not part of his calculation. The tradition whose name and whose fundamental spiritual character he was now claiming as the basis of his empire was, in the most important sense, not his tradition. He had been trained in its techniques. He understood its methods. He wielded its power with an effectiveness that no one before him had achieved. But he had not grown up on Korriban. He had not been shaped by the same deep attunement to that world's dark side that had formed the original Sith species and then the hybrid culture that had grown from them. He was using the Sith tradition as an instrument, the way a conqueror uses the language and the symbols of a conquered people to legitimate their own authority without sharing in what those symbols originally meant. The new empire that grew on Dromund Kaas over the centuries of its hidden development did incorporate Sith of pure blood lineage. This needs to be said clearly, because the picture would be inaccurate without it. When the Empire eventually emerged from its long concealment and began its campaigns to reclaim the territory it believed was rightfully Sith, it did so as a civilization that included Sith purebloods, that recognized the Sith species as a prestigious element of its population, that gave to individuals of pure blood lineage certain advantages in terms of social recognition and access to positions of cultural authority that species of no Sith heritage could claim. Being a pure blood Sith in Vitiate's empire was not a disadvantage. In many respects, it was a distinction. The academies that trained the Empire's Force users operated within a hierarchy of prestige in which Sith pureblood students began with a status that human students had to earn. The Dark Council that governed the Empire's day-to-day affairs included Sith purebloods among its members in most eras of its existence. The military and the civilian administration both drew from pure-blood lineages in ways that reflected genuine, if limited, recognition of the heritage those lineages represented. But being honored is not the same as being in charge. And being in charge within an empire, organized entirely around the will of an immortal emperor who had no particular commitment to Sith species interests, was not the same as the kind of authority the original species had exercised when Korriban was their world. And the tradition was genuinely theirs. The pure-blooded Sith in Vitiate's empire were, at best, a valued and prestigious minority within a civilization that claimed their heritage, while pursuing purposes that had very little to do with anything the original Sith species had valued or imagined. This was a long way from the valleys of Korriban, a long way from the ancestor communion and the clan sorceries and the spiritual tradition, built on the specific character of a specific world by a specific people over tens of thousands of years. The Sith Empire of the Hidden Era looked like the original Sith Empire in many of its surface features, and called itself by the same name and traced its lineage from the same events. But it was, in its essential organizing logic, something else. Something that had grown from the Sith tradition the way a tree grows from a seed, bearing resemblance to what it came from, but no longer being that thing. On Korriban itself, the world that the valley tombs and the ancient temples had been built on, and that the dark side had saturated for longer than any civilization had existed, the centuries continued to pass in their way. The hidden survivors continued their practice in the places where they had retreated. They maintained what they could of the old ways in the only conditions available to them, which were not adequate to the full expression of what those ways had once been, but were sufficient to keep the thread alive. Travelers from Vitiate's empire eventually found their way back to Korriban, because the world was too significant to the tradition's mythology to be permanently abandoned. The great academies that had existed there before the Great Hyperspace War had been destroyed, but the tombs remained. The dark side energy of the valleys remained. The bones of the ancient lords who had been entombed there remained, with all the presence and power and spiritual weight that Sith tradition attributed to the preserved dead. Korriban was rebuilt as a sacred site of Vitiate's empire. New academies were established. New students came to train there. The Valley of the Dark Lords, which had somehow survived even the Republic's assault with most of its structural integrity intact, was maintained and expanded with new tombs for new lords of the new empire. The world that had been the original home of the Sith species became the spiritual center of an empire that was not exactly theirs, maintained by people who were not exactly them, pursuing purposes that the original species would have recognized as Sith in some ways and found completely alien in others. The pure-blooded Sith who lived through the era of Vitiate's empire, who were born into it and trained within its academies and served within its hierarchy and died in its wars, were navigating a complicated inheritance. They were the inheritors of the most ancient and most legitimate claim to the Sith tradition. Their bloodlines reached back to Korriban's earliest history, to the clans and the sorcerers and the ancestor lords of an era before any dark Jedi exile had ever set foot on the planet. This was not merely a rhetorical advantage. The force sensitivity of the Sith species, their natural and unearned attunement to the dark side that had been building in their biology through generations of exposure to Korriban's particular spiritual environment, was real, and it was distinct. There were things pure-blooded Sith could access in the Force, intuitions and connections and channels of dark side power, that individuals without Sith species heritage had to work much harder to reach if they could reach them at all. The Academy instructors, who were themselves pure blood, knew this. The students who were pure blood felt the difference between their relationship with the dark side and the relationship of their human counterparts, felt in that difference something that confirmed what their heritage told them about themselves. But feeling a difference and being able to convert that difference into sustained political or social advantage within the hierarchy of a Force meritocracy is not the same thing. Vitiate's empire, like the original Sith Empire before it, ultimately judged its members by what they could do, not by what they were. And what a Sith pureblood could do was often extraordinary. But so was what a human trained from childhood in the full resources of the Sith Academy system could do. And the human population was vastly larger, which meant that even if the percentage of exceptional Force users within the pure-blood Sith population was higher than the percentage within the human population, the total number of exceptional human Force users in the Empire at any given time was greater simply because the absolute numbers were so different. The mathematics of demographic advantage in a civilization that measured worth by capability rather than lineage did not favor a small heritage species, however distinguished their tradition. This was not unique to the Sith species. It is a pattern that appears in many places and many times in galactic history. A founding people who establish something that grows beyond them, until what they founded is large enough and complex enough to operate by principles that no longer specifically advantage the founders, and the founders find themselves honored in memory, while being outcompeted in practice by the populations that came after and grew within what was built. There is nothing specific to malice in this pattern. It does not require anyone to have intended it. It simply requires time and scale and the application of consistent principles across changing demographic realities. The great conflict that history would call the Great Galactic War, when Vitiate's long-hidden empire finally emerged from the unknown regions and fell upon the Republic with a force that had been prepared for 3 centuries in secret, involved the pure-blooded Sith in all the ways that any major war involves a distinguished and capable military caste. They fought. They led. They demonstrated in the crucible of actual combat the qualities that their tradition had always claimed were their particular heritage: courage and ferocity, and a connection to the dark side that gave them advantages in the force-driven aspects of warfare that human opponents, without equivalent attunement, could not easily match. Some of the most celebrated commanders of the Empire's campaigns in that war were Sith of pure blood lineage. Their names appear in the histories of that conflict with the frequency and prominence that real military achievement produces. They were not marginalized in the war. They were central to it, in the way that a people who are a small percentage of a large population can still be central when their capabilities and their willingness to deploy those capabilities are exceptional enough. The tragedy of the Sith species in this era was not that they were invisible or excluded or forgotten. It was something subtler and in many ways harder to articulate. It was that the war they were fighting was not, in any deep sense, their war. The goals that Vitiate's empire was pursuing: the reconquest of the galaxy, the establishment of Sith dominance over the Republic, the eventual execution of whatever the Emperor's long-term plan actually was, which most Sith lords serving in that era did not fully know, were goals that had been set by an immortal human emperor, for reasons that had very little to do with the Sith species' own survival or flourishing, or the continuation of their specific tradition. The pure-blooded Sith were fighting for an empire that claimed their heritage and used their capabilities and honored their bloodlines in the way you honor a revered relic, carefully maintained in a prominent position, while no longer being the thing around which living practice organizes itself. In the long Cold War that followed the Treaty of Coruscant, the uneasy peace between the Empire and the Republic that neither side expected to last, but that lasted longer than anyone anticipated, the Sith species continued their existence within Vitiate's empire, with the peculiar combination of high status and limited power that had come to define their position. The Dark Council included pure-blood members. The academies on Korriban and elsewhere produced pure-blood graduates of genuine ability who went on to meaningful careers within the Empire's military and governmental structures. There were individual Sith of pure-blood lineage in this era who achieved things that would be remembered, who left marks on the tradition that outlasted them, who demonstrated through the quality of what they did that the original species had not exhausted its capacity to produce individuals of extraordinary capability. But the trend lines were what they were. The pure-blood population was not growing faster than the overall population of the Empire. The proportion of Sith purebloods within the total Force-sensitive population of the Empire was declining simply because no mechanism existed to reverse the process. They had never fully recovered demographically from the catastrophe of the Great Hyperspace War. The centuries of scattered survival had cost them in ways that were not recoverable through the relative stability of the Empire years. They were not going to disappear suddenly, the way a species disappears when an asteroid hits their only world or an engineered plague moves through a susceptible population with nothing to stop it. They were going to diminish gradually, the way a river diminishes through drought, each year a little less than the last, each generation having slightly fewer individuals of pure lineage than the generation before, until eventually the category of pure-blood Sith and the category of beings who had some Sith species ancestry but were not predominantly Sith in their heritage would overlap so completely that the distinction between them would cease to have biological meaning. What this meant for the Sith tradition, for the deep practice that had its roots in the dark side attunement of a people shaped by a particular world across tens of thousands of years, is the most important question in the entire story of the species, and also the one that is hardest to answer cleanly. The tradition did not end when the last pure-blood Sith who could claim unbroken descent from Korriban's ancient clans died. Traditions are more resilient than biology. They persist in texts and in practices and in the intuitions of those who have been deeply immersed in them long enough to carry something of their character, even when the original people who created them are gone. The Sith tradition in the era of the Empire and in the long centuries that followed through the rule of Darth Bane and the rule of Tu, and the slow, patient work of the Sith in their new form, through the millennia of the Republic's golden age, and on toward the events that rest of the galaxy knows as the most significant in its recent history, continued. It was real. It was powerful. The dark side responded to those trained in its methods regardless of their species' heritage, and the best of those trained in the Sith tradition could access depths of dark side power that were genuinely extraordinary. But there was something in the original practice, something that had existed when the Sith species were at the center of the tradition rather than at its honorable periphery, that was not present in the same way in the tradition as it continued without them. Something that had to do with the specific quality of the relationship between a people and the dark side, when that relationship has developed through biological immersion rather than through training. When it is not something learned, but something grown into, across generations of living in a world that breathed the dark side in every stone and every current of air. The Sith Lords of later centuries were powerful. Some of them were among the most powerful Force users who ever lived, Darth Revan and Darth Malak. In their time, the Emperor himself vitiate in his terrible and consuming way. Darth Nihilus, who had been so thoroughly consumed by the dark side that he became a wound in the Force itself, a presence that devoured what was around it simply by existing. Darth Bane, who dismantled the entire Sith Order and rebuilt it according to his own understanding. Darth Plagueis, who came closer than anyone to solving the mystery of life and death through the Force. Darth Sidious, who actually succeeded in what 1,000 years of Sith planning had been working toward. These were individuals of genuine and staggering power in the Force. None of them were Sith in the species sense. None of them had grown up in a body shaped by generations of exposure to Korriban's dark side. None of them had the ancestral communion with the dead of a people who had been practicing this relationship with the Force since before any Jedi Order existed, or any Republic, or any of the other institutions whose interactions define what galactic history means to those who study it from the perspective of the present. They were Sith in the sense that mattered to them, which was the only sense that the tradition as they had inherited it recognized. They were the dark side servants and its masters, and its expression in the living world of whatever terrible ambitions they each pursued. But the thread that connected the Sith tradition in all its later forms back to its most ancient origin, the thread that ran from Darth Sidious's long final victory, all the way back to the unnamed sorcerers of Korriban's pre-contact era, who had first learned to reach into the dark side and pull something back from it. That thread ran through the Sith species, through their blood and their bones and their particular way of inhabiting the Force. And when the species itself was diminished to the point where that thread had grown thin enough that you had to look carefully to find it, something had been lost that could not be accounted for simply by noting the power of the tradition's later inheritors. The last pure-blooded Sith in any significant sense, meaning individuals of predominantly Sith species heritage with meaningful connection to the unbroken lineage of the original people of Korriban, were not present in the time of the Empire that the galaxy knows from its most recent history. By the era of Palpatine and the Clone Wars and the great tragedy of the Jedi Order's near destruction, the Sith species, as a distinct biological and cultural entity, had effectively ceased to exist in any organized form. This is not a matter of a single event or a precise date. It is the outcome of the long process that has been described here. The gradual erosion across millennia of what had been a people of extraordinary depth and genuine significance. The world that bore their name was still there. Korriban, renamed Moraband in later galactic cartography, still sat in the Horuset system with its red valleys and its bone-white cliffs and its tombs full of darkness and the preserved presence of the dead. The dark side still ran through it, as it always had, more concentrated there than almost anywhere else, charged not only with whatever intrinsic dark side character the world had always possessed, but with the accumulated weight of thousands of years of powerful and passionate dark side lives lived and ended there. The tombs of the ancient lords still stood. The Valley of the Dark Lords still held its monuments to the greatness of beings whose names were mostly forgotten, but whose dark side echoes persisted in the stone and the air, and the particular quality of silence that existed in those valleys. A silence that was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something that had no voice, but was not quiet. The world of the Sith species endured. The species that had made it what it was, in the sense of a living people with a continuous culture and a sustained relationship with the place, did not endure with it. What remains is the name, the word Sith, taken from the people who lived on Korriban before any dark Jedi ever arrived. Applied first to the tradition of dark side practice those people had developed, then to the title given to the greatest practitioners of that tradition, regardless of their species, then to the empire built around that tradition by the dark Jedi exiles and their descendants, then to the religion that emerged from the ruin of that empire and reconstituted itself in new forms across new centuries, then to the two figures at the end of 1,000 years of patient planning who finally achieved what every Sith Lord since Ajunta Pol had dreamed of. The word traveled further than any individual Sith ever did. It became something that the original species would not entirely have recognized, associated with things they had not imagined, applied to purposes that had only partial connection to what they had originally meant when they used it, to describe their sorcerers and their lords and their relationship with the dark side that shaped their world. But the word itself, the sound and the shape of it, survived. It is one of the most durable words in galactic history, older than the Republic as it eventually became, older than the Jedi Order, older than almost any other designation that is still in current use. It comes from a people who are no longer here to hear it spoken, who cannot reclaim it or contest its current meanings, or insist on being asked before it is attached to new contexts and new figures and new chapters in the long, dark story that began on their world. The Sith species gave the galaxy a word that the galaxy has never stopped using. They gave the galaxy a tradition, a fundamental articulation of one way of relating to the Force that proved more durable and more influential than anything else they built. They gave the galaxy, through the particular combination of their biology and their world and their long history of existing in intimate relationship with the dark side, a kind of Force sensitivity that fed into the lineages and the practices of everyone who came after them and claimed the name they had originally owned. They gave all of this without entirely choosing to, without the consent of a people who did not know that a group of exiled Jedi were crossing the unknown regions toward their world, without the opportunity to decide, as a people, what they wanted their contribution to galactic history to be. Things were done to them as much as by them. And what was done by them, the civilization they built and the tradition they developed and the name they owned and the world they shaped with their presence, outlasted them in ways they could not have anticipated and would not have entirely approved of if they could have seen it. The tombs are still there, under the blood-red sky of Korriban, in the deep silence of the Valley of the Dark Lords. The tombs of the ancient Sith remain. They have been there for longer than most of the civilizations that have risen and fallen in the galaxy since the species that built them first carved stone on that world. Travelers who go to Korriban, Force-sensitive travelers who are willing to enter those valleys, despite everything that waits in them, report that the presence of the old lords is still felt, that there is something in the tombs that is not merely the residual dark side energy of a Force-active world, but something more specific, something that carries an impression of personality, of will, of the particular character of beings who lived their lives in total commitment to what they believed the Force required of them. The dark side preserves things. It is one of its qualities, one of the things that makes it so different from the light, which releases and moves on and does not hold. The dark side holds. And in the tombs of Korriban, in the valleys where the Sith species lived and ruled and built their civilization and practiced their communion with the dead, it holds what is left of them. Not alive in any way that the living would recognize or the dead would have chosen, but present. A presence that anyone with the sensitivity to feel it and the willingness to go to where it is can find. The last Sith of the pure blood lineage in any meaningful sense are long gone from the world of the living. But on Korriban, in the tradition they built, and the dark side they shaped, and the stone they carved, and the tombs they made to house their ending, they have not entirely left. They are the foundation beneath the foundation. The word beneath the word. The first darkness before all the other darknesses that followed, reaching from their red world and their ancient valleys across millennia of galactic history to the present moment. Still here, still felt, still the root of everything that bears their name. The Sith were never just a religion. They were never just an empire. They were never just a title. Before all of that, they were a people who looked up at a sky full of stars. They had no way to reach and live their lives in the valleys of a dark world with the Force coursing through them in ways they could feel but not fully explain, who built their civilization from the inside of that experience, who loved and fought and died and were entombed in the mountains they had always known, whose sorcerers reached into the darkness and pulled back power and wisdom and the voices of the dead, who survived the arrival of strangers, who became conquerors, who became something more complicated than either word can hold, who were scattered by catastrophe and sustained in hiding and gradually absorbed into a tradition that had once been theirs alone, until what remained of them was less the people than the echo. The people had left in the dark side of the Force, and the stone of Korriban's ancient mountains, and the word that every Dark Lord since has spoken without knowing its oldest meaning. Their story is finished in the way that the stories of peoples who are gone are finished, not with a clear ending, but with a trailing off, a gradual diminishment, a slow quieting. And in the silence after the quieting, if you listen carefully enough and you know what you are listening for, you can still hear something. The wind through the valleys of Korriban, the darkness in the tombs, the weight of what was built there, and by whom, and at what cost, and for what. The original Sith, the first ones, the ones who gave the darkness its name.